Shortly after graduating high school, I started down a dark path. Along the way, I met and started hanging out frequently with friends heavy into the occult. We would go to abandoned buildings, drink, and play with Ouija boards, and do other types of rituals. My best friend Tommy was a ringleader of our little group of misfits. He was the most involved and knew the most about Ouija boards and seances. He had been doing this stuff for a long time, a lot longer than anyone else in the group. He had learned from his mother, who had been messing with the Ouija boards since her youth. After one night of partying, Tommy had asked me if I wanted to stay at his house. He still lived with his mother. He asked me if I wanted to meet the man they called the Whistler. He joked this was their resident ghost that they would usually contact when playing the Ouija board in his unfinished basement. I of course agreed and went back to play. He warned me that the ghosts could become violent and that they've had scary incidents in the past. I thought he was joking since we had never had anything crazy happen with the Ouija board before. Nothing more than the normal pointer moving and answering questions. We go down to the basement. It's about 3 a.m. at this point. We light some candles and then me and Tommy begin with the normal summoning ritual. We ask if there are spirits present, and nothing. We wait in silence, waiting for the pointer to begin moving. As we wait, I hear clear as day a tune being whistled behind me. A unique tune off in the distance. Some sort of song. I hear it repeat itself twice. Spooked, I removed my hands from the pointer and asked Tommy if he heard that also. He said he didn't hear anything. We refocus and ask again if there were any spirits present. This time, the pointer moves quickly to yes and catches us both by surprise. We move the pointer back to the center of the board and ask, "What is your name?" Not 2 seconds later, I hear the same tune. Only this time, it's right over my shoulder. So loud, it made me jump. I quickly jump up and told Tommy, "I'm out of here." Running up and out of the basement, he chased after me, asking what the hell was going on. I explained, "There is no way you didn't hear that." He asked, "Hear what?" Clearly getting frustrated. I said, "The whistle." He just laughed and thought I was joking. He hadn't heard anything. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I just imagined it, but still felt uneasy about going back to the basement. So we decided to start a movie and eventually dozed off. The fact we hadn't ended the connection with the Whistler in the basement hadn't even crossed our minds, nor did what that would mean in the days to come. The next morning, I woke up and rolled off the couch to hear Tommy talking to his mother in the kitchen. I went in and said good morning. Tommy jokingly told his mother how I had heard the whistle last night while we played with the Ouija board in the basement. His mom just laughed and said sure, clearly not buying it. Apparently, no one ever hears the whistle, besides her. Not even Tommy. Without another word, I just start whistling the unique tune I had heard last night, and her smile quickly disappeared into a concerned look. She said, "That's his whistle." I go back home, and my parents are the complete opposite of Tommy's mom. Very religious, and against anything to do with the Ouija board. So like usual, I keep my experience to myself. A few days later, my mom asked me what I was doing the previous night in the kitchen around 3 a.m. I asked her what she was talking about, knowing in the back of my mind that I passed out around midnight the night before. She said, "No, I heard you whistling in the kitchen." Instantly, I got a pit in my stomach. I asked her what she was talking about, and she started to whistle the Whistler's tune. I could feel the color drain from my face. She asked me what was the matter, and I quickly changed the subject. The following days were uneventful, and as the week went on, I began to forget about the Whistler. Then one night, my dad was sleeping with one leg poking out of the covers. It was summer, and he always slept hot, so this wasn't uncommon. On this night, Coincidentally, around 3 a.m., he was suddenly awakened by someone jerking his leg so hard it almost ripped him out of bed completely. He didn't know what to make of it, and I never told him. Shortly after these two incidents, I moved out of my parents' home and haven't played with the Ouija board since. To my knowledge, all paranormal activities had ceased at my parents' house since that time as well. When I was a junior in high school, me and a couple friends decided to start messing around with a Ouija board. We got really into it for a few months until things got scary. Quick, a little backstory. My sophomore year of high school, my family uprooted me and moved me to a small town in the mountains of Pennsylvania. My parents were always buying old homes, fixing them up, and then selling, moving, and repeating the process. This time around, they decided to buy an old home that was built in the late 1800s, which had, previous to us buying it, been converted to a funeral home. It was located across the street from a massive graveyard. The home had a decent amount of acreage, with a cemetery and thick forest across the street, and cornfields behind the home. It felt very secluded. The home was not in living conditions prior to us moving there. So as we finished our school year at our old house before selling it, my dad spent a couple months living alone fixing up the new place himself to stay within the tight renovation budget. We've always been into scary movies and ghost stories, so my dad couldn't wait to tell us about the spooky things that would happen in the house while he worked there alone. Nothing crazy, just feelings of being watched or hearing footsteps on the floorboards, his radio turning on and off, or changing tracks on the CD by itself. All things that could have been cocked up to his imagination from being alone for so long up there. But still he decides to give our friendly ghost a name. Anytime we would talk about the ghost in the house, we would call him Fred. And this became sort of a family inside joke. This will be important later. Fast forward. The school year at my previous school is over, and the house is now livable, so my whole family moves in. Weird little things like lights turning on and off, or feeling like we weren't alone when no one else was in the house, weirdly enough became the norm over the following year, and we never had a bad feeling from it, so we just continued to joke about Fred. Now me and my sister wanted to fit in at the new school, obviously didn't want to be the new weird kids, so we never talked about this with any friends. Back to my junior year, my dad was out of town, and it was just me, my mom, my little sister, and my little brother home for a week or so. During this time, my friend, Rebecca, and a friend she knew from another school named Beth, called me to see if I wanted to come over because they had just gotten a Ouija board and wanted to try it out. I said sure, and we set a time for late that night to meet at Rebecca's older sister's house. Her sister had already graduated and lived in a really creepy old farmhouse, alone in the middle of the field with no neighbors in sight, so we figured that would be the perfect setting for a Ouija board. Just as the sun was fully set, and I was getting ready to go, my family was in the TV room with the door closed, watching Wheel of Fortune or something, when all of a sudden, my dog started going absolutely nuts out in the kitchen. This was startling because this was completely out of his character. He was an older dog and super mellow. Most of the time, we would forget he was even there. The whole family was freaking out with my dad out of town. My mom made me go check it out and see what was going on. I opened the TV room door and realized the rest of the lights were completely off in the rest of the house. We had been watching TV since before the sun went down, so didn't have lights on anywhere else. I made my way to the kitchen where I heard my dog still growling and snarling at something. I turned on the light to see him facing the wall like he had cornered something. His fur was literally standing on end, all up and down his back, and he had his eyes up, locked on some invisible entity, so intensely that he didn't even realize I was in the room, or that the light had come on. He continued his low growl, and I gently touched his back and asked what was the matter. He jumped, tucked his tail between his legs, and left the kitchen. Needless to say, the whole family was extremely on edge, and my mom asked me to stick around. But being a selfish teenager, I talked her into letting me still go out. Little did I know, That simple decision to leave my house that night would lead me down a dark and dangerous path that would haunt me forever. Now, I had never played with a Ouija board before, but Rebecca and Beth both had years prior at a slumber party, so they both knew a little how it worked. We sit down and try to make a connection. We ask, "Is there a spirit here?" And nothing happens. We ask again a few times. Then suddenly we have a little movement. I thought for sure someone was messing with me, but they both denied it. We ask, "Is there a spirit here?" It replies yes. We move the pointer back to the center and ask, "Do you know one of us?" It moves to yes. Naturally, we ask, "Do you know Rebecca?" Thinking that was the most likely, because we are in her sister's house, after all. It moved to no. We said, "Do you know Beth?" Thinking that was the next logical answer, since they had been long life friends. It said no. We said, "Do you know John?" My name. And it moved very quickly to yes. My heart stopped for a second, and my hands got sweaty. I muster up enough courage to ask, "What is your name?" It moved to F-R-E-D. I got noticeably uncomfortable. Beth and Rebecca were confused and asked if I knew a Fred. I never told them or anyone about my house being haunted or anything about Fred. I asked Fred if he was what my dog Buddy was barking at tonight in the kitchen, and he said no. I asked, "Are you the only ghost in my house?" And it said no. I asked, "How many are there?" And it said 3. I asked if they are all good spirits, and he said no. Just then, we heard a big thud in the closet, quickly said goodbye, and got the hell out of there. Naturally, we told all our friends about the experience, and Rebecca's sister's house quickly became the big hangout over the next few months, where we would play at least a few times a week with a large group of friends that wanted to experience it as well. We would also play in other people's houses in different locations, and each time, after a few connections, it seemed we would always end up talking again to Fred at least once or twice a night. This was unsettling because we never played in my house, so he seemed to be attached to me wherever I went. As time went on, the connections got stronger and things got weird. I remember on one snowy night, we all gathered and played under an old-style chandelier in the dining room of Rebecca's sister's farmhouse. One of my buddies brought his girlfriend Carly, who was terrified of the idea of playing and wanted nothing to do with it. She thought she was coming to a party, but when we broke out the board, she sat in the other room, drinking a bottle of vodka herself, trying not to pay attention to what was going on in the dining room. We began with speaking to Fred, who gave me a warning. I asked if there were still 3 spirits in my house, and he said no. Now there were 8. I asked if I should be afraid, and he repeated yes, over and over. I asked what should I be afraid of? He kept repeating the same word that I didn't recognize, and it made no sense to me. I don't want to say the word out loud. More on that later. Eventually that night, we connected to another spirit, but this one became pretty nasty. The spirit was stronger than any we had talked to before. As the pointer moved swiftly around the board, the lights would flicker, as if the energy was being sucked out of the air to move the pointer. The spirit kept swearing and calling us vulgar names. The longer we talked, we noticed the chandelier above us started swaying softly. We asked who it was swearing at. As we asked this, the chandelier began to swing progressively more violent, and it spelled out C-A-R-L-Y. By the time her name was completely spelled out, the chandelier was so out of control, we were afraid it might crash down on the table, so we moved the board in the living room. Carly ran out of the house bawling hysterically after it called her out by name. I don't know if it was adrenaline or what, but my buddy then did the unthinkable. He broke the one rule we had from the beginning. He asked the spirit to reveal itself. This was a huge no-no. It gives the spirit way too much power, and we all agreed never to cross that line. But honestly, we were so addicted to the whole thing By this point, we were all a little curious. When he asked, everything stopped. The light stopped flickering, and the chandelier stopped swaying. Nothing. Just silence. We sat there for a while, and eventually the adrenaline wore off. The board stopped moving, and we assumed we lost connection with the spirit. We decided on that note to call it a night. We all went home our separate ways. That night was one of the coldest of the year, and between the old insulation and my parents trying to save money by barely even running the heat at night, the house was freezing when I went to bed. Despite this, I woke up around 3:30 a.m. in a miserable sweat. I was so out of it from being stirred from a deep sleep, I didn't really make the connection of how abnormal this was. As I slowly came to, I realized I had kicked off all my blankets and was only covered by a paper-thin sheet, but I couldn't cool down. I was burning up. As I slowly woke up more, due to being so uncomfortable, I look around my room, which was unusually dark. Between the glow of my alarm clock across the room and my window shades being open, with the bright light of a big street lamp that always illuminates the room, I couldn't understand why the room seemed so dark. The clock was still on, but no light escaped it. The street light was lit, but the light stopped outside my window. As I continued to wake, more of my attention was directed towards the corner diagonally across the room from my bed. In the corner stood something large. I couldn't make any shapes out, but it was the absence of light, a heavy darkness you couldn't only see, but feel. It's hard to describe, but if you have experienced it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a feeling you will never forget. There in the corner wasn't a spirit lurking, but a demon staring right at me. I've never felt so much fear and uneasiness in my life. It was just staring at me, not moving, not making a sound, but it was aware that I was awake and I knew it was there. I never prayed so hard in my life and vowed to never touch a Ouija board again if this demon would leave me in peace. I eventually fell back to sleep after what seemed like hours of praying, and woke the next day to everything back to normal. I never touched a Ouija board again, but I later looked up that word Fred warned me about that night, and to my disbelief, it was the name of an ancient biblical demon. I pray I never cross paths with that type of evil again. In the fall of 2012, I was 19 and home visiting my family from college for a long weekend. I grew up in a small town in Utah, and in our very small town, there was an old cemetery that was supposedly haunted. Now, I never really believed in that sort of thing and never gave it much thought or interest. So despite growing up about a mile from the cemetery, I had actually never been to it. In school, we learned a lot about the pioneer history that was tied to our small town, so I was aware that the cemetery had a very old section of tombstones with plots dating back to the mid-1800s. That weekend I was back, I spent a lot of time with my brother Jeremy. Jeremy was a couple years younger than me, a junior in high school, and we were always very close. One night, we were hanging out with a couple of neighbor friends we had grown up with on the same block. Their names are Justin and Adam, and both were seniors in high school at the time. We spent the night with a little fire in the backyard, catching up until it had gotten late. Eventually, somehow, we had gotten on the topic of ghost stories, and that cemetery came up. Adam told us that a few of his friends had gone up during the summer and had seen an old pioneer woman walking between the gravestones, and then she had just vanished behind an old mausoleum. Adam and Justin both wanted to go up, so we thought, why not? It's late and we were running out of wood to burn. It was early October and the nights were cold, so I grabbed the keys to my mom's minivan to drive the mile to the edge of the town where the cemetery is. The cemetery is up on a hillside, so I parked on the street along the edge of the hill. None of us had been there before, so we really didn't know what we were looking for. We pulled out our cell phones for the flashlights and wandered through the headstones, scanning names and dates. Eventually, we came to the old section of the cemetery. We were able to easily identify it as such because it had an old metal fence about knee-high, blocking off a rather large section of gravestones. Now the cemetery wasn't small, but also wasn't massive. So, despite us being on the far side, at the top of the large hill, we could still look down and see the street where we were parked with our minivan under the street lamp in the distance. As we entered the old section, me and my brother Jeremy stayed close and went to one end, and Adam and Justin went in the opposite direction. None of us were saying much, just looking around among the tombstones and reading what information we could that wasn't worn with time. Justin and Adam were now at the mausoleum on the furthest side of the cemetery when we heard them start yelling to try and provoke a spirit. They yelled, "Where are you old hag?" among other worse insults. They then took turns peeing on the mausoleum and nearby headstones as they yelled and tried to provoke the spirits even further. Me and Jeremy weren't okay with this and thought it would serve them right to play a joke and make them walk home. So we slipped away and made it down to the minivan as the other two were distracted. We hurried and started the engine and pulled away quickly to not give them a chance to catch up. To get home, we had to pull into and go through an alleyway that was directly to our right. As we rounded the turn to enter the alley, we noticed an old woman with her back turned to us. She was dressed in old raggedy looking clothing, something like you'd see on Little House on the Prairie. She wasn't fazed by the headlights and didn't even seem to notice our car coming up behind her. She was slowly moving forward with her head down, still facing away from us, with a broom in her hand, just sweeping back and forth, as she slowly inched her way forward. We were still laughing about leaving our buddies back in the cemetery and weren't comprehending how weird of a situation this was. We didn't think to ourselves, why is this old woman sweeping the street at what was now around 2:30 a.m. in the morning in the freezing cold? Our laughter at leaving our friends quickly became frustration with this lady who was in the middle of the alley, oblivious to the fact that we needed to get by. So, with my patience running thin, I pulled to the right and popped both passenger side tires of our minivan onto the sidewalk in order to inch past this woman who refused to get out of our way. We are pulling up right behind her now, and still, she doesn't even acknowledge we are there. Now, we are inching right beside her, and I look out my driver's side window. We are so close to the woman that I was most concerned about making sure my side mirror doesn't clip her. As I inch past her, focusing mainly on the mirror, not wanting to knock her over, her head slowly turns sideways and comes face to face with mine through the thin piece of glass. And as we make eye contact, a hauntingly eerie smile spread across her face. I still get goosebumps thinking about that look on her face and how the hair on the back of my neck stood up when we locked eyes. She continues, never missing a beat with her sweeping, and I got the overwhelming feeling something wasn't right with this woman. As soon as we cleared her, we got off the sidewalk and booked it home, both of us silent, not knowing what we had just witnessed, or why we felt the way we did because of it. Neither of our first thoughts were of her being a ghost because she looked as real as both of us. However, there was something just off about her, and neither of us could shake the disturbing feeling we were left with. We get back to the fire pit and burn through the last of our wood. About 30 minutes later, Justin and Adam show up and blurt out, "What the hell, man?" they said. "Why did you leave us, and why haven't you been picking up your phones?" We both looked at our phones, and both seemed to be working fine, but no missed calls, which was strange because we've never had any issues with service in our town, and especially not at our house. We told them about the old woman sweeping, and they didn't know what we were talking about. They said they were coming down the hill as soon as they saw us pulling away and realized we were leaving them. And they saw us going down the alley. They could even clearly see down the entire alley from up on the hill and were confused why we drove up on the sidewalk and why we were going so slow. My heart sank when they said they were confused because there was no one else in the alley with us. We were completely alone.
I was that stereotypical high school emo girl with the Ouija board permanently in the trunk of her car I was always ready to play at any given time during one of our adventurous night excursions. When we were bored and wanted to get spooked, we have about 5 extremely old and run-down cemeteries within 20 miles of my small Pennsylvanian town, and we would usually end up in one of them. I was well aware of the rules of the board, so definitely not just some dumb kid. I just loved to be scared. So I was around 18, this was in 2006, and on one of our onboard Let's Go Explore Barclay Cemetery excursions, we planned to be there and to play at midnight. A little backstory. Barclay was a mining town during the 1800s. Most of the population was wiped out by diphtheria. There are even reports of residents being buried alive to contain the spread, along with a bunch of other creepy, terrible things. The cemetery at that point was not much more than a wooden archway with Barclay carved into it, with run-down, tipped-over, broken gravestones, along with the leftover rock foundation of the small church. The graves were also raised due to the ground settling and many holes dug by animals, often right in front of the gravestones. Anyway, me and about 2 carloads of friends show up armed with flashlights. Flashlights tend to die quickly while in this cemetery, so backup candles were also ready on standby. We were early, it's not midnight yet. We walk around, giggle, and scare each other. The cemetery is always silent. There's no noise, not even animals to be heard. It really sets the tone as a creepy place. We find a tall column-type gravestone that is knocked over on its side and would make the perfect table for our Ouija board. As you approach the knocked-over gravestone, the writing is not visible. We are on the edge of the graveyard. To our back is the forest where the church foundation remains. We set up our board. My best friend and I sit side by side, our backs to the forest, facing the entrance. We start with the typical, "Is there anyone there?" It answers yes. "What is your name?" "Sarah." "How old are you?" 23. "Were you married?" "Yes." "Any kids?" "Yes, 1. At this point, we hear 2 footsteps coming from the forest directly behind us. Now keep in mind we've been to this cemetery on many occasions before, and always make note of the dead silence without ever hearing birds or owls even. All our friends are in front of us with flashlights pointed at the board. The first flashlight dies. That friend is done. "F this," she says, and back to the car she goes. We continue. We ask a few random questions, get answers. Then we hear 2 more steps taken towards us. We hear the leaves rustle and a stick break. The footsteps stop. We look. Shine lights, there's nothing. We start whispering amongst ourselves, speculating. As we are looking towards the forest, 2 more steps. Honestly, to best describe the steps, it felt and sounded like a curious kid who's afraid to get too close. Okay, well now they are too close. We get nervous and we say goodbye to Sarah. We've succeeded in getting our scare, but as we are about to run back to the car, I'm curious. Whose grave were we sitting on? The name faces the ground on the forest side of the tombstone. We couldn't see it when we sat down. My best friend and I go check it out and lean down below the leaning gravestone to see if we can make out anything. Gravestone read, "Sarah Strange, wife of Morris Strange, 23 at death, mother. Had baby's birth and death date, the same date. The baby did not live more than 1 day." Our board had all the info correct. We had not visited this stone before. Despite being in the graveyard multiple times, we generally stayed clear of the church area. We then ran to the car and got out of there. I've been back many times. I always take note to visit Sarah when I'm there. I've had some strange, scary, inexplicable things happen to me in my childhood, but this event will forever haunt my existence. I was 13 years old at the time when my best friend, we'll call her Sarah, and 2 other boys in our grade decided to hang out in town. We grew up in a small town in New Jersey, where there wasn't much to do besides hang out at local parks and such in the area. We decided to walk to this one park on a lake that sits at the bottom of a large wooded hill. On top of the hill is a cemetery. It was broad daylight in the early afternoon, and we decided to just take a walk through the cemetery and thought nothing of it. My best friend was wiping off debris from tombstones and monuments in an effort to respect the dead. We were reading the gravestones and speaking aloud the names of the deceased individuals. It was actually really peaceful. The four of us decided to sit in a patch of grass a little ways away from the graves to relax after walking around. We naturally sat in a circle formation, and Sarah was next to me to my left. We were engaged in conversation when I suddenly noticed Sarah had gone really quiet. I looked over at her and she was staring off into nothing. I immediately asked her if she was okay, and she sort of snapped out of it and said yes, she's fine. A minute or so later, she was staring into space again, and she covered her ears. I asked what was going on, and she said, "I can't hear, they're screaming at us." Now I'm terrified, and I ask who is screaming. She doesn't respond and starts to rock back and forth. My heart is beating out of my chest. I call her name again, and I instinctively throw my cell phone, a bulky NV2, right at her head, and she didn't even flinch. She rocked back and forth for a few more seconds before looking down into her lap. She then looks up at me with the most evil, demonic smile. Her face was fixed in an expression I've never ever seen her make, and so it didn't even look like her face. Immediately, I knew she was possessed. This was my absolute worst nightmare come true, and I was terrified to my core. There are no words to describe the overwhelming amount of fear that consumed me. My fight-or-flight response kicked in and I just blacked out. I came to a few seconds later and found myself about 100 feet away from her and the boys. She was still staring at me, smiling, completely still, not even blinking. I was screaming and crying her name and I was frozen with fear. She finally broke her demonic gaze from me, looked back into her lap, got up, and ran away right into the woods. It took me a few seconds to unfreeze, and I came to the realization that she was in danger and I needed to go after her. I ran and grabbed my cell phone and followed her into the woods, down the hill, and to the park area where I find her sitting on a swing. I approach her and I ask if she's okay. She's extremely disoriented and asks, "Where are we? We need to stay. We need to go back." I said, "No way in hell are we staying. We need to get the hell out of here. I literally have to drag this girl out of the park." The park and cemetery are located on Native American grounds. There was a group of people at the park for a cultural event who asked us if we were okay and if one of us had screamed. I just said yes, it was me, but everything is fine. When we got out of there, we all just had a what the hell just happened moment of silence. Sarah did not remember anything that happened. She said she remembers sitting down with us on the grass, and she remembered the voices screaming at us and that they were telling us to leave. Then she said she felt like she was having a nightmare and was dreaming of what she assumed to be hell because there was fire everywhere. She didn't recall saying she wanted to stay at the park or being dragged out. The boys were speechless and didn't really have much to add. From that day on, I would have demonic nightmares 4 to 7 nights a week until my freshman year of college. The nightmares would always involve a possession or extremely dense, heavy air that signified a demonic presence. I was always weighed down by the energy and could barely get away in time when in my dream I realized the demon was present. I'm still friends with this girl to this day, and we have only mentioned it a handful of times. My logic was if I ignored it or didn't speak it into existence, it would go away. Eventually it did. Once in a great while I will get the nightmares. To this day I can't help but wonder if I was haunted by the demon after the incident, or if it was just some severe PTSD.
When I was in high school, my parents moved us from the States down to South America for a couple of years. My dad was a full-time missionary in our church, and he got assigned to help a small remote village in Bolivia. When I say remote, I mean remote. This place was pretty off-grid, with only a couple hundred people living in the area. There wasn't much, but there was a very old church that was on the outskirts of what one might call the main town area. This church is where we spent most of our time. This story is not my own, but was told to us by one of the local clergymen that we befriended and became quite close with during our time in the area. He had grown up in the village and told us of a young family that lived there in the late 80s, early 90s. The young couple had a daughter who was around 4 or 5 years old, and they were new to town, but quickly became very active members of the congregation, so everyone got to know them in no time and they fit in well. their daughter started talking about her friend who she would play with at church. This started happening after a few months of her family being there, and she would only talk to her friend when she was in the church. The congregation is small, and there was not another girl close to her age, so the family didn't pay much attention to their daughter's new imaginary friend and just figured she was going through a stage which isn't abnormal for kids her age. This went on for months, and eventually the daughter would start to disappear. The family would search frantically and eventually always find her sitting alone in the dark basement of the church. When they would ask what she was doing, she would always say her friend wanted to show her something down there. More concerned for the daughter's safety and not wanting her to go down, scrambling in the dark getting hurt, they put a padlock on the door, and this put a stop to that. Eventually, the girl asked her parents if her friend could come home with them. Not thinking much of it, the parents said sure and laughed it off. Remember, the town is very small, so the family lived not far from the church and would usually walk from home. It was only about a 5-minute walk. At home, they would hear their daughter playing and talking like she had a friend in her bedroom. They would ask her questions about her friend like how old she was, what does she talk about, which oddly enough, when they got to this question, the daughter wouldn't ever answer. They would move on and ask what the friend looked like, and she described her as a girl her age, having yellow hair, blue eyes, and light white skin. This was strange to the parents because their family, which were native Bolivians, had only ever lived in remote areas of Bolivia, never had a TV, and it would have been impossible for their daughter to ever have any exposure to a white girl with blonde hair. This really confused the parents. Why would she make that up? And how? This went on for a while, until one night, the father gets up to check on the girl and she isn't in her bed. He frantically looked all over the house and she is nowhere. The wife wakes up and panics now as well. The husband rushes to the church to find the phone numbers of a couple men from the congregation to see if they can help search for the daughter. When he arrives at the church, the front door is locked. He fumbles with his keys and opens the heavy wooden door. As he rushes to his office, he passes the basement door and notices the padlock is unlocked and flipped to the side. He cautiously opened the door and looks down, but the basement is pitch black. He's just about to close the door and lock it, but then he hears his daughter's voice from the basement. It sounds like she's arguing with someone. He yells down to her, flips on the lights, and runs down to find her in the middle of the floor, sitting Indian style, facing away from the stairs. He grabs her, infuriated and relieved at the same time. Once they got home, they talked to her and asked her what she was doing and how she even got into the church. She said her friend wanted to show her something in the basement and took her there. She said her friend let her into the basement and she doesn't want to be friends with her anymore. The dad asked if that's why she was arguing with the friend when he found her, and she said yes. Her friend has been trying to get her to hurt her mom. The friend had told her the family was going to move away, and she needed to take a knife from the kitchen and stab her mommy when she was sleeping so they could always be friends. Her parents were terrified. They were actually planning on moving back to their hometown, but never said anything to their daughter. Needless to say, they ended up expediting the move, and the church was blessed from any evil. This family wasn't aware at the time, but our friend, who told us the story and had grown up in this village, knew the history. He told us the most alarming part of the story when they told it to him was when she described her friend. The town had in fact been founded by, and the church has been built by, Nazi Germans who escaped to Bolivia after World War II, white with blonde hair and blue eyes. Ashamed of the history, the town has scrapped any evidence, such as photos, and none of the descendants of the original founders were still around. Until then, my family had been the only white people to live in the town, or even visit for that matter. I was never one to believe in ghosts or spirits. That is until I moved into apartment 210. You see, in 2013, me and my wife split. I got split custody with my children. I had to find a local place with 2 bedrooms that was big enough for when I had my kids. No, nothing happened here at first, and my kids and I really made it our home. But then after a couple months, it begins. One night, I am in my room and it's 2:30 in the morning. I hear my kids banging toys around and giggling in their room, and I hear their TV come on. Irritated, I call out, "You guys are supposed to be asleep. Don't make me ground you." The banging and giggling stop, but I hear the TV going, and I get up and walk to their shut door, still half asleep, and say, "Okay, kiddos, I told you to go back to..." As I begin opening their door, it occurs to me that my kids are at their mom's. I had taken them back to her the evening before. A chill runs down my body as I slowly push the door open to see toys strewn all over and a cartoon playing on the TV. I turn the light on, unplug the TV, then bolt to the living room, shutting their door behind me. I turn all the lights on in the apartment and sit on edge all night. Nothing else like this happens, but the next week, while my kids were there, I'd catch my 3-year-old daughter, Alexis, talking to somebody when my 6-year-old son wasn't around. So I asked her who she talked to, and she replied, "My friend old mom. Her kids got burned up, so she is nice to me because I look like her little girl." My daughter said this word for word, and usually she couldn't talk that plain. I immediately call her mom and ask her what she's been watching over there, but her mom says just her cartoons. I once again got chills down my entire body. My son never saw what Alexis saw. Over the next few months, my little girl continues to talk to and about old mom, sometimes even pointing behind me, telling me old mom is there watching me to make sure I'm a good daddy. Very creepy. Over the past few years, my little girl has gotten to like spooky stuff and is fascinated with scary shows and movies. But at this time, she was only 3 and had never seen scary stuff, so I was really getting concerned and had a hard time sleeping. Then one night, I was reading a kid's book called The Monster in My Closet to my kids. They were lying in bed when I was sitting in a chair next to her bed. At the end of the book is a page that says for the kids reading it to draw the monster in their closet. This gave me an idea. I told my daughter to draw old mom for me. She sits up. I give her a pencil and the book, and she says, "Can you move, Daddy? She's behind you and I can't see her." I scoot away a little, and my little girl looks in the direction where I sat before, then looks down, draws a little, looks up again, then draws some more, and continues to do this until she finishes. She hands me the picture. I look at it and begin to tremble. That weekend, we moved to an apartment in the next town over. Some might say it was her imagination, and she just made up the drawing, but she was 3, and I believe if she made it up, she wouldn't have taken her eyes off the paper as she drew, but she kept looking up as she drew, and that tells me she was looking at old mom while drawing her. You would know why I moved after seeing this drawing.
I wouldn't necessarily call this a possession, but as a child, there was something evil coercing me to think badly. I remember fighting with all my might to not act upon those thoughts. I was about 5 years old. My little sister and I always had imaginary friends. I had my 4, and she had her 4. One day, I found a 5th one, and unlike the others which were in my head, this new friend was the one I would always speak to as if it was a real person. My mom would be cooking in the kitchen while I'd be in the living room, talking to whatever was there. I've never talked to my imaginary friends like that before. The conversation always seemed serious and like an actual topic when my mother would overhear me speaking. My mother was confused. "Who are you talking to?" she'd ask. "Bodoy," I'd respond. My mother thought it was a strange name, but never thought anything of it. I have a good memory. I can remember most of my childhood like it was yesterday. I recall the moment his presence became more extreme. He'd tell me to hurt my sister. He'd tell me to hurt my mom. I'd always scream at him in response. I never wanted to hurt anyone. This is when things take a turn for the worse. My sister and I were having a tea party in my room with our imaginary friends. I was the only one who could see Bodoy. He was a little boy, your average-looking 10-year-old kid. "He's not real," my sister yelled. In order for her to believe me, I needed proof. "Bodoy, open the closet," I said, looking straight at my sister. I was angry that she didn't believe me. But I wasn't as angry as he was, and that frightened me. My closet door opened, and my sister screamed. I remember my parents running in, and my whole vision went black as I passed out. After that, Bodoy wasn't so nice to me. Instead of appearing as a 10-year-old boy, he began to appear in the form of a black shadow with red glowing eyes and sharp white teeth. He'd stand at my closet all night. I'd scream every time he'd show his teeth. My parents would run in, and I'd say, "Bodoy is scaring me with his teeth." My mother never knew what to do about it. They told me to tell him to go away, though this became an every night occurrence. I'd scream, they'd run in, tell me to tell him to go away. It was a very exhausting situation. Now that I'm grown, my mom told me this. She woke up in the middle of the night to my father screaming, "Jesus." He was quite religious. My mother was confused but was too tired to ask. She rolled over and saw a black shadow standing in their bathroom. Once they had woken, my father told her exactly this. I had woken up to a little boy running back and forth in front of the bed, screaming curse words trying to make me angry. I screamed Jesus to make it go away. So, they put the pieces together and made the connection that this must be Bodoy and that I was actually being terrorized by something evil. They reached out and found help through the church, who in turn performed a religious exorcism type cleansing to the house and me. I never convulsed or anything like an actual possession. I was cooperative and I repeated all the words the preacher wanted me to. To this day, I haven't seen Bodoy since the day of the exorcism, but I sometimes get paranoid that I will see him again.
This happened many years ago when my family moved into an old farmhouse. I was about 3 at the time. The house was so old that the walls were hand-split boards covered by newspapers and layers of wallpaper and paint. My mother believed in the supernatural, but my father was a skeptic and made fun of any belief in the paranormal. So my mother never really talked about those kind of things when I was growing up. So here I am now, many years later, having been brought up to be skeptical about anything paranormal, but knowing there are a lot of things that I can't explain from that house. One of the many is my lady in black. As a 3-year-old, shortly after we moved into the old house, I suddenly developed an imaginary friend. I'd never had an imaginary friend before, but my mom just accepted this as a passing phase children go through. Unlike most children, however, my friend was apparently an elderly woman in a long black, high-necked dress, white hair in a high bun, with a rather distinctive white horse brooch around her neck. I always referred to her as my lady in black. Nothing much there, I suppose. A lot of children have imaginary friends. Here's where it gets a little weird though. When I was about 4, my mother was frantically looking for me in the house one day. I was ill and supposed to stay in bed. She couldn't find me inside anywhere. She even started checking under the beds and in the wardrobes. She was about to leave the house to look for me when she looked out the kitchen window, and there, I was in the yard with my father, filling the water trough. About 30 minutes later, I came in. Apparently, I stopped at the door of the kitchen, cocked my head to the side, and looked up, as if I was looking at someone tall standing beside me, and then looked at my mother and asked her why she was looking in the wardrobes for me when I was with my father. I then looked up again and then back to my mom and said, "I'm sorry I scared you." My mom asked how I knew she was looking for me, and I told her, "The lady in black told me you were worried," and then named all the places she had looked for me and said, "But then you looked out the kitchen window and saw me with Dad." My mom had no way of explaining this, and it really freaked her out. I also remember telling my mom that the lady in black came to say goodnight to me and tucked me in every night. I found out years later that my sister would get visits too. As I got older, I stopped talking about the lady in black openly because my father didn't like it, but I still would acknowledge her presence to my mother, who was much more open about these things. When I was about 8, my father started renovating the inside of the house and removing the old hand-split boards off the walls. My mother told me later that while removing the walls, an old photograph fell out, and it was a picture of an elderly woman, white hair and a high bun, dressed in a long, high-necked black gown, and at her neck was a white brooch, exactly how I described my imaginary friend in the years before. My description never changed, and I'd even draw pictures of her. My skeptic father passed it off as a coincidence, but since I'd always mentioned a white horse brooch, he got out a magnifying glass to look closer at what was around the woman's neck in the photo. He then tossed the photo and the magnifying glass down, swore, and left the house. My mother then looked at the photo with the magnifying glass. Closer examination showed it was a white horse facing the exact way I had described it. When my father left for his afternoon shift, my mother got out all her old family photos, some from the same era, and mixed the photo from the wall in among them. She laid them all out on the kitchen table before I came home from school. I came home, saw the photos on the table, and immediately picked up the picture of the woman and asked what her name was, because this was my lady in black. I remember that because I was so excited to see this picture and finally found out who she was. My lady in black didn't come around as much after that. I don't know if I got too old, or maybe opening the wall and finding the photo released her in some way. When I was in high school, me and my mom lived in a smaller home that always made me uneasy. The house was older and outdated, but wasn't overwhelmingly creepy just by looking at it. However, what made me so uneasy was the constant feeling I was being watched in the home. Day or night, it did not matter. One rainy Saturday, I woke up late and went downstairs to eat a bowl of cereal. As I poured my milk, I distinctly heard my mother's voice calling up to me from our basement. Now, our basement was by far the most terrifying part of our already creepy house. I never saw anything or had any reason in particular to hate this basement, besides just the feeling of despair I was overcome with every time I had to go down there for anything. Like something bad had happened down there. The feeling of being watched seemed to intensify every time I was in the basement. The basement was a dirt floor cellar with cobwebs everywhere. Our washer and dryer were downstairs, but besides from running in and out as quick as possible to do laundry, I avoid this basement at all costs. "Randy," she called. I stepped to the top of the creaky wooden steps, looking down into the basement. I peered down into the complete darkness. Was I hearing things? No, I couldn't have been. Then again, I hear, "Randy." I yell down, "Mom, are you down there? Why are you in the dark?" A second goes by, and in response again I hear, "Randy, come down here." I flick on the light switch and see the faint glow of a single hanging bulb. I start to descend into the basement slowly to allow my eyes to adjust to the poor dim lighting. I reach the bottom of the steps and look around. As I mentioned, our basement wasn't used for anything besides laundry and a little storage, but we didn't have much down there. I quickly realized my mom was nowhere to be seen. But then I noticed something odd. On the far side of the cellar, we had an old wooden door that led into a crawl space that we never used for anything. The crawl space had no lights whatsoever and always seemed damp, so not ideal for storage. This was odd, because the door was open, but we always kept it shut with a deadbolt. "Mom?" I called almost in a whisper now. "Are you in there?" Now I heard it again, and this time, I was certain it came from the dark crawl space, only this time, it sounded deeper within. "Randy, come here." Instantly, my blood ran cold as I remembered my mom was taking an extra morning shift at work today, and I was home alone. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could and slammed the basement door shut. I was shaking with fear, and to this day, I still often wonder what was down there, deep within the crawl space, and what would have happened if I went in there.
I had seen and felt spirits for years up until I was around the age of 15. After blocking off experiences, I completely forgot about it and continued my life as normal until around the age of 20, when I had my first child, and he was about 1.5 years old. I was washing dishes at around 8 a.m. and let him play with the pots and pans. He was having a lot of fun and giggling to himself, when suddenly I heard my sister scream out, "Shut that damn baby up!" Mind you, my sister is a school teacher and one of the kindest people you'd ever meet, so I was completely in disbelief. I ignored it and kept letting my son play. Within 10 to 20 seconds, I hear, "You want to go around procreating these little shits and you can't even control them? You shouldn't have had it in the first place." At that point, I was infuriated. I started screaming back and then heard her bedroom door slam. She started laughing hysterically and was taunting me to come and show me what you got, she said. Her words were horrible, especially accompanied by that sinister laugh. This was completely out of character for her, and I'd never seen her act like this. I stormed through the house and got to her room, her still laughing through the door. I barged at full speed into the bedroom, and the laughing stopped abruptly, with no one there. I immediately felt the hair on my head stand up. I was alone. No one was home but me and my son. Within seconds, my phone rang. I felt like vomiting at this point. It was my sister. I answered and she sounded distressed, saying, "I had a terrible feeling about you. Are you okay?" I didn't explain what had happened at that point because I was still mid-shaking. But I said, "I'm fine. Are you okay?" She explained that she had forgotten to tell me that she had left the night before because her friend needed her to babysit, so she had stayed there all night. You bet your bottom dollar I fled the house after that call. I didn't take any of my son's things. I just grabbed my son and we both left for the shopping mall in our pajamas. I bought all the supplies we needed that day at the mall, including nappies. I didn't go back to that house until my mom came home in the evening.
When I turned 16, I temporarily moved in with my friend and her family. I've had many paranormal experiences up to this point, so when I do encounter something, I usually keep it to myself instead of questioning and asking about it. I had always been sensitive to paranormal things, so I never mentioned anything that I saw or heard. I would assume it was just me. Well, let's jump into it. It started with me having random sleep paralysis attacks. I've always suffered from sleep paralysis, so it was normal for me. I would just watch something afterwards to calm my mind and go back to sleep, except it didn't work like that here. I had to remove myself from the room in order to even get an hour of sleep. I brushed it off as an odd occurrence or just getting used to the new place. Well, one night I woke up, fully able to move, not hallucinating or anything yet. I can hear talking in the closet. 2 kids at first. I ignored it and was going to go back to sleep, but then I was concerned because why aren't the kids asleep right now? And why are they hiding? I decided to ear hustle a little bit. I heard a little girl whisper that she didn't like me, and a boy say that I scare him. More whispers. I shuffled in the bed, trying to be quiet, so I can see which child is scared of me, but the closet was only slightly opened, and it was pitch black in there. That's when I heard very clear and audible, "Shh, she's awake, she'll hear us." Then everything went dead silent. That sent chills down my spine. I had just remembered that we only have 2 kids in the house, both girls, both asleep right beside me and my friend. The girls had made beds on the floor and were sound asleep. There was no possible way I could have heard children in the closet, especially not a boy and girl chattering. I didn't want to be freaked out, so I just tried convincing myself I was hearing the TV from the other room. I left the room and slept on the couch. Just another weird thing, right? Well, that's not it. Whenever I'm in the room by myself early in the day or at night, I would hear creaking in the ceiling. At first, I assumed the house was settling, but then I noticed the creaking would start on the other side and always drag to my side until it was above me. Every day, no matter which side I was on, it would travel in my direction. Starting with a simple creak, then a pause. Then it would drag closer, then pause again, then drag even closer. I always left the room when that happened, and I could hear it follow me until I passed through the doorway. If I told anyone, they'd just say the house was settling, or that it was cats or mice on the roof. Whatever, you can cover that up, but you can't cover this next thing up. I had started seeing my friend hide under the living room coffee table and kitchen table, but I'd only see it briefly as I walked past. When I would do a double take and look again, she would disappear. I assumed this was all in my head. Nope. Because one day I had fully seen her in the living room sweeping. That was her chore, cleaning the living room. And mine was to clean the kitchen, which is next to the living room. We could see each other clearly and I even talked to her. I said, "You're up early." And she just nodded and kept sweeping, which I assumed she was still tired. I then walked past her sweeping, though only to run into her in the hallway. I was so confused. I walked all the way back to the living room and nobody was there. I even started searching the kitchen in case whoever that was hiding. Nope, didn't find her. I told her I had just seen her sweeping, but she said she had just woken up and that I was seeing things because it was early and I was still half asleep. But I knew I wasn't, because I was washing dishes, and touching water wakes me up more. Okay, here's the climax. I ignored all of that, but this was the final straw. I should probably explain that we don't have a door that leads immediately to the back. We have a door that leads to the side of the house where you walk the narrow short path along the house to the backyard. Anyways, it was night and my friend's older brother asked me to take his dog out to go potty. She's a fairly big dog, a husky mix. I don't normally go into the backyard at night. When I do, it's quick because the lighting is terrible and you can hardly see anything in that big yard at night. I turned on the side light and I let her out to pee. She wouldn't go if I didn't go, so I walked out with her. She freely roamed the yard, and I waited by the corner of the house under the overhanging patio roof. Everything was fine. I couldn't see her for a bit, but then I caught sight of her sniffing silhouette. I knew she had probably finished and was just exploring and enjoying herself. Then I heard a creak above me. It sounded like weight was being applied to the roof above me, and I felt like someone was hovering over me, but of course, I didn't want to psych myself out. So I just ignored it and kept watching the husky. Problem was, she wasn't sniffing around anymore. She was just staring at me or in my direction. I thought she wanted to go back inside, so I called to her. When I called out to her, she shifted a bit, turning slightly towards me, then back. She seemed alerted at what I thought was me, but after further observation, I knew she was watching something else. She would not move for the next minute, and I could hear more cracking and creaking above me. I tried to ignore it and play it off like it didn't bother me, like it was nothing. So I took a step back and I heard it follow. I called her to come inside, but she didn't move. Then I took another step back. The movement followed me again. This sent me into panic mode, and before I knew it, I took off running towards the door. It followed me to the door. I heard it dragging from the corner of the roof I was standing under, following me along the side of the house, always remaining directly above me. I could feel a strong urge to not turn around and to just get into the house. It was just as fast as me. I ran into the house and slammed the door. Thank God the husky was just as fast as me, because as soon as I took off, she took off. When we got inside, she ran right to my friend's brother's room, and from what I heard from him, she hid under the bed. I was no longer panicking. I was pissed. I went straight to my friend's mom's room, where they were talking about heaven knows what, and I explained everything that happened in the backyard. I told them that I was chased into the house by something on the roof, and that it was most definitely not the house settling. That's when they all gave each other a weird look, and that's when I knew this house was not normal. They explained to me that there is something wrong, and that they'd just ignore it to keep it from getting more active, and that it was a good thing I didn't try and look at what chased me, because if I did, I would have been scared. The mom told me that her daughter, my friend, had let a friend bring a Ouija board over, and they played with it all night attempting to contact spirits, and that ever since then, weird stuff had been happening, such as seeing a look-alike of her daughter walking around and catching a glimpse of her daughter under tables, or hearing something drag across the ceiling, following them around. She explained all the things that I had personally experienced in the house, even though some of it I had never told them. She said that they had even gotten the house blessed, so they thought it would go away, but it only subsided. Needless to say, I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, but these occurrences never stopped.
I never really believed in the paranormal or supernatural. I always thought the stories about people being haunted or possessed were just stories made up for entertainment, or cases of severely mentally ill patients being misunderstood by fanatical priests claiming demonic possession. I never suspected that they were actually real. But when I was 13, my naive brain would be put in its place. It was the summer of 2007. Life was good. I had a pretty normal teenage life. I had a few friends my age who lived in the same neighborhood as me, and we would do a lot of outdoor activities like hiking, mountain biking, and fishing. We lived just north of the Ozark Mountains in a nice little town in Arkansas. My father had worked very hard to give us all a good life. He came from a poor family and joined the military at 18 to better his future, and it paid off. He got a good job working on airplanes, and we moved to the country. My parents got a steal on a really nice old house in the village. It was a really nice little community built into the woods, which had golf courses, private lakes and trails, and its own shopping center with a couple of restaurants. We were a happy, normal middle-class family. That is, until that thing showed up and ruined our lives. There were a lot of local legends about the natives that used to inhabit the area. Supposedly, our entire community was built on top of sacred land. I used to walk the trails near my house a lot, and you could find cliffs and overhangs with Indian paintings on the walls and remnants of their civilization. The kids at school would often scare each other by telling tales of shamans summoning skinwalkers, and that to this day, they still haunt the woods at night, looking for a midnight snack. I always laughed it off. Ghosts and monsters aren't real. They're just made up stories to scare kids. I always thought the ghost hunter shows were ridiculous. You wouldn't hear or see anything on camera, but the people in the show would jump at creaks in the night, and suspenseful music would play while the camera focused on empty darkness. Those shows can be fun for the imagination, but the reality of paranormal entities is much more terrifying. They can tear apart families and bring your whole world crashing down. I would learn this dark reality one summer night. The air was cold, my window open, and could hear the wind flowing through the leaves. The cicadas, reverberating through the midnight woods, put me in a sleepy trance. I relaxed and drifted off to sleep. In such a peaceful place, I was completely safe. I always felt one with the woods. It really is beautiful here. Cradled in the sounds of nature, I drifted deep into sleep. Then a wave of panic. I feel every hair stand up. Chills down my spine. I feel the eyes of someone on me. I can feel their sinister intent. Every fiber in me is telling me to run. There's something here that wants to kill me. No, worse. It wants to own me, to see me suffer. Has been watching me for a long time. I've been chosen. I can't breathe. Help me. Help me. I scream, Mom. I hear laughter, not human, not a physical voice. Multiple voices of all octaves laughing at once. I can't open my eyes. I can't breathe or talk, but I can see its eyes. Blue bloodshot bulging eyes, huge pupils. Red is filling my mind. I feel pressure. My entire body is vibrating, and I feel like I'm going to explode. I gasp as I fully awaken, but as I open my eyes, I freeze. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Through my open door, I can see something laying on our living room couch. It's clearly visible, but clearly not a person. It's like a shadow, but flowing. The moonlight illuminates its face, a skull with a sinister smile. It has those same eyes from my dream. Huge, bulging, wide, open eyes. Crystal blue pupils.
It's staring at me, smiling. It's awkwardly sprawled out on the couch, and its shadowy body, like a translucent but pitch black cloak, flows as if underwater. I'm getting chills just remembering this, and I want to be clear. This is not a fictional story. This really happened. I was so scared I was frozen. I felt electricity going up and down my spine, through my brain. My eyes were wide and watering. My mouth hung open. It stared into my eyes, into my mind for what felt like hours. It then quickly shifted out of sight. It darted down the couch and into the shadows. Adrenaline hit me. I ran into my parents' room. I burst open the door, panting and covered in sweat. My parents were at first annoyed, and it was a typical thing parents do when something like this happens. But as I described every detail of my encounter, and when they saw how terrified I was, I started to see a look of unease and fear in my father's eyes. He was scared. He believed me. My father, being a devout Christian, believed in demons, and he was convinced I had just been tormented and that I was in danger. He was very serious, and I could see that he was disturbed by what had just happened. He woke up my little sister, and the whole family had gathered in the living room. I wish my dad had never done what he did next. He got out his Bible and turned the pages to a verse. I don't quite remember the actual verse, but it was something about casting out the demons. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave my family alone," he yelled angrily, cursing the demon. "If you want one of us, take me. Leave my family alone." We sat in the living room, talking well into the night, and after a while, we were all tired and went back to bed. I couldn't sleep though. I couldn't forget those eyes, its evil smile, the way it moved. It was disturbing. Fast forward a few months, and things were normal. Me and my sister went back to school, and for the most part, I had forgotten all about the demon. I had even convinced myself it was a bad dream, or even sleep paralysis, even though that was the only time sleep paralysis had ever happened to me. I went on with life until we got the worst news I had ever heard to this day. My dad was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer, and it had spread. He was dying. We were devastated. I hugged my father and cried all day that day. I couldn't believe I was going to lose my dad. He was always so strong and seemed very healthy. The weird thing is, the doctors were also puzzled. His cancer was usually found in teenagers. It was a cancer that almost 100% of the time was only found in boys and in their early teens. This shocked me and made me feel guilty. The whole experience of the demon became prominent in my mind, and I remember my father's words to the demon. I think it had its eye on me, but went for my dad instead. I wish it had taken me though. My family would be better off today if it had. My father remained positive through his sickness. He went to chemotherapy sessions, started eating healthier, and worked out as much as he could. With his bald head and amputated leg, people would often come up to him and thank him for his service. He always laughed and said thank you because he was a vet. However, contrary to what people thought, his condition was much worse than if he had stepped on an IED. He lived for 3 more years, even though the doctor said he had less than a year to live. He always stayed happy and positive, more for our sake than his own. But towards the end, he started to slowly deteriorate. It was awful. I couldn't do anything to help him. The man I looked up to, who protected us, who I always saw as invincible, was crumbling before me. He lost all his weight and started sleeping on the couch to not disturb my mom. He was so sick. He suffered so much. I would hear his death rattles and moans and want nothing more than to help him in any way I could. Something that disturbs me so much to this day is that I started to realize something. He more and more resembled the demon. He was getting so thin, he looked like a skeleton, and he had very blue eyes. Sometimes he would just look at me from the couch, and I would get chills. The demon had been mocking me, imitating what he would do to my father while viciously smiling, as if it was funny. This enrages me. How can something be so vile, so purely evil? My father soon died and left us a broken family. My mother fell into a deep depression. I looked after my little sister, tried to be the best father figure I could, even though I was a poor substitute. We fell behind on the bills, and the bank foreclosed our house. We lost everything. The next handful of years were a struggle, but now I'm an adult, and I've gotten some sort of stable life. I recently figured out why my father was so shaken that night, and didn't just blow it off as a bad dream. I visited my sister recently, and we started talking about ghosts and the paranormal. I asked if she had seen anything like that, and she hesitated for a second, but then told me, and what she said gave me the chills. She was very young the night I saw the demon, and had largely forgotten that night, but she told me she used to see a shadowy man standing at the end of her bed. He had a skull for a face. My father knew this, and realized it wasn't a coincidence, or a child's imagination at that point. Demons are real.
I'm an eternal skeptic. I believe in things such as God, angels, demons, etc. But when it comes to ghosts and such, I tend to be on the fence. I am a spiritual person and can feel good and evil, even just by walking into a room. But I am undecided about ghosts of people who have died. Starting around the age of 3 or 4, living in Blackfoot, Idaho, I constantly heard my name being whispered, every day, several times a day. Whether in the bathtub, a crowded room, an empty room, in bed at night, outside during the day, it didn't matter. I heard it loud and clear. Constantly. I remember asking my older sister, who was 3 years older than me, if she ever heard it, and she replied that she always hears her name being whispered, and she thinks it's normal. She said that everyone probably hears their name being whispered, and it has to do with our eardrums or something. So being the young child I was, I believed her when she said it was normal and never thought twice about it. I continued to hear it throughout my entire childhood, and would dismiss it upon realizing that no one around me was actually calling out to me. Moving on to my teenage years, living on a small farm in Oklahoma, I still heard my name being whispered quite a bit, but not nearly as often. It dwindled from several times per day to perhaps a couple of times per week. I still never thought to question it, but it did begin to creep me out. Around this time is when I also began feeling presences about me. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they completely frightened me. I began to think I was crazy, but I learned to live with the feelings and tried to ignore them. When I stepped into my 20s, I moved to Texas. This is when all hell broke loose. In quick summary, I began seeing dark shadows, hearing children's laughter and crying, hearing footsteps when home alone, feeling something sit on the edge of my bed at night, feeling hands on me when I was completely alone, etc., etc., etc. There were even several instances when I would be driving my car, and something would jerk my steering wheel to one side and nearly cause me to crash. Then I obtained a roommate who claimed to see demons and angels. He claimed he saw 2 demons hanging around me, but that there were also 3 angels, so I needn't worry. I didn't believe him, but didn't tell him that for fear of offending him. Upon getting to know him better, I discovered that he had an extensive collection of books about demons. One particular book about how to summon a demon. Oddly, I found him in the bathtub one day, fully clothed with no water in the tub, sitting with the book and attempting to summon a demon. Naturally, I thought he was crazy and asked him to stop it. But he explained that the demon was already summoned and that he could control it since he was the one who summoned it. I told him to stop with his fantasies and to leave my home if he was going to act so absurdly. He then told me that he had asked the demon to show itself to me, but that it was not allowed to harm me or possess me. I didn't believe one bit of his ridiculous story and went about my business. That very week was when scary things began to happen to me when I was at home alone. The first was that a glass bottle lifted off of the kitchen counter and then dropped straight to the floor, shattering. Still being the skeptic I am, I searched for open windows, doors, ceiling fans, any sort of breeze, but nothing. I still have no explanation. Next, I was watching a movie one night. It had something to do with a demon, but I can't remember what movie it was. Right as the demon was coming into character in the movie, I laughed and said that's so stupid, when I felt a hand literally sweep my lower back from right to left, and every hair on my body stood on end. I jolted out of my chair and glanced the entire room to see what could have touched me, and nothing was there. I chalked it up to imagination. The next day I was getting ready for work and was in the bathroom applying makeup. As I was leaning into the mirror to apply my eyeliner, my eyes turned from dark brown to jet black. and suddenly I wasn't looking at myself, but rather something was staring back at me. I completely froze and nearly cried, and when I tried to look away, I couldn't. Something was holding my stare. I began to panic and wanted to cry, but for some reason I said aloud, "Let me see you." Instantly the stare was broken and my entire reflection in the mirror was clouded by a black shadow, concealing my face entirely. With instant regret, I began crying and shouted, "Leave." The entire incident lasted maybe a minute or two. Within about 5 minutes of the incident, my demon summoning friend walked into the house and found me on the floor in the bathroom, shocked and shaking. Though I don't remember sitting down, he laughed and said, "Did he finally show himself?" I said some nasty words and told him to get the hell out of my house and take his crap with him. There was no blaming my imagination for the final incident, and there is no way someone could have staged that. The last thing I'd like to add is that I now have a 13-year-old son, and unfortunately, he is the biological child of that former roommate I kicked out. He knew I was pregnant with his child at the time, but upon kicking him out, he began to claim the baby wasn't his. I allowed him to make the claims because I knew I wanted no part in raising a baby with the likes of him. And quite frankly, I feared him. When my son was very young, he would talk to people who weren't there, stare at the ceiling or corner, and he often hears his name being spoken even when no one has said a word. He's also very sensitive to good and evil presences, as am I. My son is not evil or anything out of a scary movie. He's a good boy with a wonderful heart and soul. We are both Christian and have an abundance of faith. This story is about my mom's experience with the demon that plagued her life. I am skeptical about a lot of things. Even though I have opened up more as an adult, this is how I remember my mom describing him and the torture she endured. To begin, my mom was around 12 the first time she encountered him. She described him as tall, wearing a black coat with a black expressionless face. Well, if you could call it a face. This incident happened at my mom's aunt's home. My grandparents were at work and my great-aunt would watch my mom. Their apartment was laid out as follows. You entered the front door into the living room. The stairs are directly to your left and there is a 250-pound handmade wooden framed couch along the same wall as the stairs. The living room led into the dining room, which led into the kitchen. My mom was coming from the kitchen, and as she stepped into the living room, she saw this figure wearing a dark cloak come through the front door past her 15-year-old cousin, who was sitting on the couch. It was obvious that her cousin could not see him. The tall hooded figure saw my mom immediately and put his finger to his lips as if saying, "Shh." He started up the stairs, and as he did, he waved his hand. With the wave of his hand, the huge couch flipped over on top of her cousin. He was trapped underneath with the couch on his back. As far as I know, he didn't break his back, but he had a fractured rib and a broken finger. Everyone in the family wondered how this could have happened. My grandma is a very religious woman, as are most of the older people on my grandma's side of the family. But when my mom tried to explain, no one believed her. That was her first experience with this demon. Fast forward many years later in 2009, I'm 15. It was December, around Christmas, when I started to notice something wasn't quite right with my mom. She was vomiting up everything she ate. She was sleeping or lying in bed for hours and hours each day. At the time, she was working as a surgical technician for a heart surgeon. So, when all of this started, she was going to work less and less. Eventually, she quit, and that is when things really started. I'll share my first encounter with this demon, but this is first and foremost my mom's story. It was late one night, around 11 p.m., and my mom was really sick. She had been lying in bed all day just staring at the ceiling. My dad went in to take her some dinner, and all he said was she didn't look right, so he decided, after coaxing my mom into the car, that he was going to the ER to get her checked out. I was in my room in the basement, listening to music and finishing up my book I had gotten from the library that previous Friday. I thought I heard gravel crunching around my window directly above my bed where I was laying, so I stood up and moved my curtains out of the way. I saw a black face wearing a black hood. His face wasn't like a regular human. It was expressionless, almost like it was made out of clay. I screamed and fell backwards onto my bed. I rolled off, hiding next to it, only to realize my 13-year-old sister was upstairs alone. I peeked out of my door into the basement. To my left was the basement door leading outside, and to my right the laundry room and the stairs that lead to the first floor of the house. Once I realized it was clear, I crawled to the stairs and slowly started up them. The basement door was open, and since I didn't see or hear anyone upstairs, I went up into the kitchen. My sister was standing there with her hands on her hips and said, "Why were you screaming? I'm up here trying to watch a movie." Before I could respond, I heard gravel again. I ran to the kitchen window, which was directly above my bedroom window, and saw my parents pulling up the driveway. Once they were parked, I ran outside telling my dad about the strange man that was peeping in my window. He pulled out his pistol and started to do a check around the property, telling me to stay with my mom. When he came back, he told me he couldn't find anyone, that the car coming up the driveway must have spooked him, and he ran off. I knew that it wasn't a man, it just had to be something else, but my dad brushed it off and just helped my mom into the house. Did he know who it was that had scared me so badly? Did he know about this demon before my sister and I did? We got my mom settled and into bed. It was super early in the morning, maybe around 3 a.m. when I sat down and started to fill my mom in on what I had seen. She just brushed it off and told me the same thing my dad had told me. Your dad and I must have scared him off. I didn't understand then why they weren't calling the police to report a crazy man staring into people's windows. But I eventually calmed down enough to sleep. Monday came without incident, and as I was going to my second to last class of the day, I was told my dad was here to pick me up. When we got home, my dad sat both me and my sister down and told us the news. My mom had gone to the doctor today and they had found stage 3 terminal cancer in her lymph nodes, both kidneys, and her lungs. They had given her just a few months to live, including going through chemotherapy and radiation treatments. My mom had been fine 4 months before. She was working out, doing everything a strong woman would be doing. She had gone to the doctor just 4 months ago, and now she's lying in bed sick and dying. I went into my parents' room and just cried with my mom. After I had calmed down, she told me the story about when she first encountered the demon she called Seth, and that she believed it was him I had seen the other night, peeping in my window. Months went by. It was summer now, and my mom was still with us, clinging on to life like she was stranded at sea with no water or food. She was more like a zombie, having random days where she was a normal person. We had our pastor come out and bless our house, along with one of his friends. Yet, as it usually goes, the disturbances got worse. I was seeing him now, out of the corner of my eye, watching me while I did my homework, read, or whatever I was doing. When I looked, he was gone, possibly off to terrorize my mom. My mom would say he would stand in the corner of her bedroom, telling her to murder her family, kill herself, and to stop fighting him. This was constantly going on. She was eating like she was a toddler, eating no more than a few bites of anything she had put into her mouth. I know this seems normal for individuals that have cancer, but it was different. As time went on, about 8 months after the cancer was found, she wasn't any better. But she wasn't any worse either. Eventually, our pastor told us he had found a friend who ran a Pentecostal church. Our pastor had simply told his friend that he was sending some people to him to meet and see if his church was a good fit for us. He didn't tell him our names or why we were going. That Sunday, we packed into the car and made the 2-hour drive to the church. I had only ever been to our small church before, and when I entered the doors, I was blown away by how many people were sitting in the pews. We quickly found seats just as the preacher was starting. He went on for a few minutes, welcoming everyone back, and started the service. To explain Pentecostalism, it is a Protestant Christian movement that emphasizes direct personal experience with God through baptism with the Holy Spirit. They also can speak in tongues, which was really odd to me at that time. Basically, if you've ever watched the show Supernatural, in season 1 a character gets electrocuted and they go to a church, and the preacher healed him. That is very similar to how things go in a Pentecostal church. Continuing into the regular service, he stopped and said, "There is a person here with cancer, severe cancer that has affected their lungs and kidneys. A man stood up in hopes to be healed, but then he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but this person also has cancer in their lymph nodes and has been deemed terminal." That is when I looked at my mom, who was just sitting there, staring up at the preacher. She stood up, followed my dad. The preacher had described her condition to a T. "Welcome, we've been waiting for you," he said. Our pastor hadn't told him anything. Our pastor is a very trustworthy man. He has never steered us wrong, and despite none of our family going to church anymore, we are all still very close. He officiated my sister's wedding and will do the same for my youngest sister and myself. So, we walked up to the front of this church, a couple hundred people staring at us, smiling at us. I had no idea why we were here, not until after all of this. I guess my parents didn't want to scare us. We arrived in front of the preacher. I don't remember much, but what I do remember has stuck with me and still makes me feel very uncomfortable. Two women came to stand beside my sister and I. They wrapped their arms around our shoulders and just stood with us. My mom knelt before the preacher and he put his hands on her, with my dad and about 8 other people behind her. I asked the woman next to me what they were doing to her, and she asked me how old I was. I was almost 16 when this went on. I told her and she said that they were exorcising a demon from my mom, that everything will be fine and she'll live for a very long time. I started to hear this growling coming from the group across the altar, near my mom. I looked up, finding her, only to find something that wasn't my mom. Yes, that thing had her hair, body, and clothing, but it wasn't her face. Her face was distorted. My mom has blue eyes, but now they were replaced with these huge dark eyes and a malicious smile. I could only assume the thing that had made my mom this way was finally showing his true face as he fought the people praying against him. People had their hands in the air, speaking tongues, and people started to put their hands on my sister and me. As someone with severe social anxiety and claustrophobia, I was freaking out just from that. I heard screams, growling, and my mom's distorted voice pouting profanities at everyone. I don't know how long this lasted, but when the screams and growls stopped, there sat my mom, who was seemingly fine now. I ran to her, happy she was okay. We sat there for a few minutes, and everyone started to clear out. The preacher, his wife, and family came to speak with us and invited us to talk more about what had happened over dinner. We agreed and followed them to our agreed-upon place of dining for the evening, a Pizza Hut. That dinner was the first real food my mom had ate in a year. She ate a large pizza to herself, along with salad, wings, and breadsticks. She says that it was the best meal of her life. This was a Sunday, and since we had quite a bit of a drive, we said our goodbyes and headed back home. The next day, my mom went to one of her doctor's appointments that week. On Mondays and Fridays, she would go in and get scans done to check progression. The previous week, she had appointments on both days. When they brought her scans back to show them to her, they showed no signs of cancer. There was not even a speck of cancer anywhere in her body.
I don't really know how to start this because I've never spoken to anyone about it, but I'll try my best to explain it. A few years ago, when I was with my now ex-girlfriend, we were in bed. She was sleeping, and I was awake, but drifting off to sleep. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and her room went cold. I mean, freezing. Doors and windows were shut, so I knew it wasn't a draft or wind. I didn't think anything of it, because I've never experienced or read about paranormal events. My girlfriend woke up sweating and crying about 2 minutes later, saying there's a woman in the corner, and she was really scared. I thought she was joking at first, maybe a bad dream, so I comforted her and said, "It's okay, don't worry." But I was freaked out. The next thing that happened is a reason I've never told anyone because, 1, I know people won't believe me, and 2, it still freaks me out just thinking about it. We were under the cover for some comfort, I guess, so she couldn't see around the room, when suddenly something or someone grabbed her by the ankle and dragged her down to the bottom of the bed. I literally had to grab her and pull her back up with all my strength, almost like tug of war. Scariest thing that's ever happened to me by far. My girlfriend started screaming when she looked at me and said my eyes were completely black. No pupils, no white parts, just all black, like I was possessed. But I felt fine. I was myself. So, I got the flashlight on my phone and looked around the room, and then jumped out of bed and turned on the lights. Nobody. Nothing was in the room. To this day, I can't get my head to understand what or who that was.
From a very early age, I have had weird things happen that I cannot really explain. This story is about a house we lived in 1986 in Southeast Texas. It's absolutely 100% true. I was 6 years old. The address was Dyer Avenue. The thing I remember most about living here is the little girl. I do not know her name. All I know is she was always there. For years, I thought she was one of my parents' friends' kids who my mother babysat or was always visiting, but she was always looking for her father. I remember her waking me up many nights to ask me when her dad was coming back. My parents usually had company and I would get in trouble for sneaking out of bed at night to get a peek at who was over, so I would always stay in my room. The little girl was always asking about her father and when he would return for her. She often looked ill, with dark rings around her eyes and pale skin. She had long blonde hair to about the middle of her back with bangs, just like me. She wore a gray and white polka-dotted dress with a gray and white striped apron. Her shoes resembled what I would call pilgrim shoes with a big shiny buckle. Her socks were folded down and had lace around them at the ankle. For years, I thought this little girl was a part of my childhood. When I asked my mother and father about what happened to her, they said they did not know what I was talking about. When I described her and her clothing, my parents turned white as a ghost and said, "You saw her too?" My mom and dad said they would pass by my bedroom and see what they thought was me sitting in front of the toy box in my room, playing. But then they'd pass by the kitchen window and see my sister and I playing in the backyard. When they would go back to my room to see who was playing at the toy box, toys would be strewn about, but nobody would be there. These are memories that not only I have, but my mother and father as well. My sister was too young to remember the house or anything about it. Strange things happened there. Something would lock the dog up in the laundry room. The door had a latch that latched from the inside, but the dog was constantly getting locked in the room and barking and wailing like he was being beaten. The dog barked at certain spots in the house and was always on edge and growling and gnashing his teeth at something we could not see. There were sounds from the attic like stomping and banging. Sometimes sounded like something being dragged across the floor above our heads. My dad would go up there in the middle of the night trying to find out what was causing the noises. Nothing ever found, not so much as a raccoon or squirrel. Something blacked both of my dad's eyes one night when all the power went out. He accused my mom of punching him in the face in the dark, but she says he was trying to drown her in the bathtub during the power outage. Neither were near each other at the time. They were both attacked in the darkness on opposite ends of the house. Their bedroom caught on fire 4 times in the year we lived there. This is the very first paranormal experience I have ever had that I can remember. I have had many more throughout my life, but I will never forget the little girl that eternally lives in my childhood home. I think about her often and I wonder if she ever found her father.
So, I have for most of my life had experiences with the paranormal or spirits, as you will. I've had several things happen to me as I've grown up and even as an adult. And my own children have had experiences, but one in particular stands out above the rest. It was truly terrifying, and I still don't sleep very well because of it. At the time, I was a young mother in my early 20s, living alone with my 3 children, who were then the ages of 6, 5, and 3. My daughter being the youngest, and my 2 boys, 6 and 5. We were all asleep, except for something I'm still unclear of today. Woke up my eldest son. I heard him say, in a very chilling and low voice, "Mommy, Mommy," trying to get my attention. I awoke and sat up to look down at him. He was on a mattress on the floor with my other 2 children. I asked him, "What? What's wrong?" He said, "Mommy, there's a scary lady standing next to you. just looking at you. This instantly made me frantically search around the room, and I kind of yelled at this moment. What? What lady? I don't see anything. My youngest daughter had woken up from the commotion by then and said nothing but pointed in the direction my son was looking in. I started to feel every hair in my body stand up at this moment, while he then said something I'll never forget. This scary lady comes almost every night and stands in front of our beds and just stares and smiles at us while we sleep. She's even told me she wants to take me home with her. I was paralyzed with fear, and my light switch was all the way across the room, so I didn't even want to move. I desperately scanned the room in an attempt to see what he was talking about. My middle child at the time then wakes when my daughter starts to cry, and while still looking in the direction my son was, she says, "Who are you?" I then literally panicked, but still felt frozen with fear, trying to see what all three of my children were seeing. My eldest then darted for the light switch, while my two other children screamed loudly, "Mommy! Mommy!" Then, the light switched on. They all continued to cry, but I quickly searched around the room, stating that the scary lady was gone. When I asked why they screamed and what they saw, my eldest proceeded to tell me that the scary lady dressed in a long white dress, old and tattered with a scratched up face and long curly blonde hair with dark black eyes, was starting to walk towards them with a slight grin and terrifying stare, and said she was taking them home. I, at that moment, didn't want to turn off the lights. All three of them in unison proceeded to explain to me what this lady was doing, what she looked like, and even what she was saying. Apparently, I was a threat to her and had in her mind taking her children, and she was angry with me for that and wished me dead. She wanted my children for herself. My children saw her numerous times, always just standing next to my bed looking down at me with hate and anger as I slept. I couldn't sleep with the lights off for a very long time after this first occurrence, and after the second and third, we all agreed we would feel better with the lights on permanently. Needless to say, I tried to deal with this unsettling experience as long as I could bear, as I tried to save enough money to move. I'm happy to say she did not follow us. Since then, my children still can't sleep unless the light is on. They all said the scary lady will forever haunt them. I hope that's not true, but that's my story from this scary moment in my life. Ghosts are very real, and even though we may not be able to see them, they exist and can see us. I'm forever changed because of this experience.
From the outside, it seems to be an average nondescript house, the kind of place that you'd likely find in any city or small town. It's not, though. This house is like something out of the Twilight Zone or a Stephen King novel. You see, I lived in this house when I was 11 to 12 years old. That was 1993 to 94. My room was the one above the porch with a double window. My sister's room was across the hall. My mother and my brothers lived downstairs. During the time we lived there, strange things occurred. Some of them you may find hard to believe, and that's fine. I can only assure you that they actually happened. Some 26 years after the fact, I can provide you no evidence, and only my solemn word that everything I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth. For starters, sometimes our clocks would run backwards for no discernible reason. We'd change the batteries and check them for defects. But nothing seemed to be amiss. They just randomly started running in reverse from time to time. There was also an issue with our basement. How do I describe this? I guess the best way would be to say that the basement seemed to be a portal to hell. We would hear strange noises coming from down there that couldn't be explained away as creaking pipes or the house settling on the foundation. Things like demonic growling, roaring, When someone had to go down there to do laundry, there was a sound like people whispering, and the whole area had an unsettling feel to it. We had this dog, a German shepherd named Lassie. She was an exceptionally brave, loyal, and protective dog, but she would not go near the basement or the basement door. Eventually, she became so terrified that she ran away and never came back. There was also a night when we all woke up to find a big black crow, or raven, I'm not sure, in the house, flying madly around. This was in the ungodly hours of the morning, mind you, so no one would have been up to open a door or window to let it in. If you can even imagine an intelligent bird like a raven willingly flying through an opening into a human dwelling like some kind of idiotic sparrow. There were no holes in the roof and no place for it to get in or out. Where did it come from and where did it go? I have no memory of us actually getting the bird out of the house, but I never saw it again. Then there was the man. At the back of the house was a hallway that led off the dining room and past the kitchen towards the lower floor bedrooms. The twins, mere toddlers at the time, had their nursery in the rearmost room on the left. They would sit back there and have conversations with someone that none of us could see. They referred to this person as simply the man. The man seemed to enjoy keeping the boys company, but he was anything but benign. One day while the rest of us were at school, my mom had the twins in their high chairs, feeding them lunch. When she stepped away to do something, I don't remember exactly what, there was a crash and the sound of screaming. One of the twins was on the floor. His high chair tipped over. He'd bashed his head really hard. The high chairs had been secured on flat footing before she started. When she asked the other twin what happened, he replied, "The man did it." My little brother ended up in the hospital in a coma for a long time. You might be happy to know that he survived and today is married with 2 beautiful daughters. But CPS didn't believe that my mother was innocent and began to stalk us. They would park across the street from our house and watch us. They would drop in unexpectedly. They were looking for a reason to take us and put us in foster care. This is how we ultimately ended up leaving the house. Rather than deal with any more tragedy or weirdness or stalking, we packed up what we could and moved across the country. What we couldn't take with us, we left behind. I asked my mother once, about 5 years before she died, if she'd ever actually seen the entity that the boys referred to as the man. She said she had, but only once. She said she was walking past the kitchen door one day and had caught sight of someone in her peripheral vision. A tall man wearing dark clothes, standing with his back to her, staring out of the kitchen window. When she turned to get a better look, he was gone. That house scared the crap out of all of us. There was always a feeling like we were being watched. Thankfully, it is many years and many miles behind us. When we left, there was no one to pay the mortgage, so the bank took possession. Because of this, today it is privately owned by people I don't know. For that reason, I will not disclose the location. I won't even tell you what state it's in. If you're ever unfortunate enough to stumble upon it, however, I advise you to keep walking. Don't stop to look. Because if you stop to take a look at this place, there's likely something you can't see staring back at you.